Thank you everybody for joining today's session on preventing burnout. We will go ahead and get started momentarily, but before diving into the content, I wanted to say a big thank you to Risha for moderating this conversation. It was great collaborating with you on this event, and I hope we have more chances to work alongside one another moving forward. To provide a quick overview of my background for those who I have not met, my name is Triston Francis and I attended Wharton where I majored in finance, legal studies, and business ethics. While in college, I spent summer internships within sales at Google, then private wealth management at Goldman Sachs, then investment banking at Morgan Stanley, where I joined full time after graduation. While at Morgan Stanley, I worked across a variety of divisions. I started by covering consumer retail companies within investment banking. Then I transitioned to sales and trading, where I covered our largest asset management accounts. After doing this for a few years, I joined an internal strategy role to help launch a team focused on increasing business with Asian, Black, and Hispanic clients. And after all of these experiences, I then moved into talent management and focused on internal mobility and specifically how to move our top performing analysts from one division to another. After Morgan Stanley, I went to Harvard Business School for my MBA. I had three primary goals during business school. First, I wanted to develop leadership skills. Second, I wanted to study organizational behavior. And third, I wanted to gain personal clarity on the type of work that I wanted to pursue with my life. There were two main experiences at Harvard that enabled me to develop as a leader. First, I served as the student body co-president of my class. In this role, my objective was to foster a cohesive, collaborative community on campus. I had the opportunity to lead an exceptional, diverse team of more than 70 classmates and manage a budget of more than 1.3 million. The second experience was serving as the education representative for my section. As context, each MBA class at Harvard is approximately 930 students, which is broken down into 10 groups of 93, which we refer to as a section. Every section elects one representative who serves as the liaison to their professors. These two roles allowed me to give back to my community while fueling my growth as a leader. In terms of classes, I focused largely on organizational behavior. My highlight was spending 1.5 years working with Professor Leslie Perlow, who serves as the head of research at Harvard Business School. Alongside a small group of MBA students, we co designed a course called Crafting Your Life, which launched in the fall of 2019 and has been taught to roughly 100 MBA students at Harvard thus far. This course aims to help students clarify their purpose and live with greater intentionality. While serving as a research associate, I completed approximately 120 alumni interviews. Each interview began with the same question: tell me about how your life unfolded after HBS, highlighting the major personal and professional transitions which you went through. What were the trade offs that you had to make, and how did you come to those decisions? In addition to informing the modules that would be taught during the Crafting Your Life course, these conversations provided me with tremendous personal and professional clarity around the impact that I aspire to have. The impact I want to have with my life can best be summarized through two core questions that I hope to spend as much time as possible thinking through during my career. The first core question is, how can companies create a culture where their employees are engaged and excited about their work on a daily basis? The second core question is, how can one best help another person reach their full potential? To address my core questions at an organizational level, the relevant topics where deep expertise will best enable me to have an impact are organizational design, human capital management, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. I joined consulting as a way to continue developing my expertise in these areas, and I felt that the Boston Consulting Group, and particularly our people and organization practice area, would be an ideal way for me to further explore and build experience within these topics. At an individual level, the relevant skills that will best enable me to help people reach their full potential include coaching, public speaking, and writing. Every few weeks, I host an open invite professional development event on Zoom. In addition to giving back and helping professionals navigate their career, I also cherish these sessions as a way of honing my coaching, public speaking, and writing skills. This ultimately equips me to most effectively help others reach their full potential and prepares me to accomplish this mission at scale. If interested in learning more about the Open Invite professional development events and to see a list of the upcoming sessions, please visit my personal website or scan the QR code on the left. If the upcoming event topics do not include your greatest areas of interest, please let me know what topics you would like to see covered, as I welcome suggestions. Feel free to reach me via a message on LinkedIn or by scanning the QR code on the right. Thank you for tuning in for this discussion, and without further ado, I am excited to dive into today's conversation on preventing burnout.
Just want to say thanks to everyone for being here today. I'm really excited to have Triston with us to speak to how he manages his intense work-life balance, as well as just prevents burnout by working in the professional services industry. So I think I just want to start off with a quick introduction. I'll actually give a little bit of background about myself first, then hand it off to Triston to give a little bit about himself. I am Risha. I'm a second year business analyst at McKinsey out of the Los Angeles office. Really excited about just finding ways to maintain balance, especially during the pandemic. We've been in the pandemic for about a year now. So just wanted to kind of host a session to make sure that we're all thinking about ways to maintain balance. And I thought Triston would be a perfect person to ask about this. So handing it off to you, Triston, to introduce yourself and also just sharing your background, your growth journey, moving from Wharton to Morgan Stanley to Harvard Business School and now to BCG.
Looking forward to the conversation today and would love for it to be as open and as candid of a conversation as possible. So it'll be very interactive. It's a small enough group. So for people on the line who have questions, please do feel free to dive into the conversation. Just to give a little bit about my background and how I've thought through some of these things. I'm originally from New York, first generation college student. So when I showed up on campus at Penn, I had no idea what I wanted to be. And it was really a process of looking at a lot of upperclassmen, talking to a lot of people, which is what gave me a sense for some of the things that I was interested in doing. So experimented with a bunch of different internships while on campus. Did sales at Google, private wealth at Goldman, banking at Morgan Stanley. Ultimately decided to go into banking at Morgan Stanley. A big piece of the decision there. Yes, I always had an appreciation for the fact that I would learn a lot in the role, but also going back to being the thought of being a first generation college student and realizing that at that point in time when I was graduating from college, I was going to be making more than others in my family had ever made before. And that put me in a position to be able to support people in my family. And had I gone into education, or something that I was a little bit more directly passionate about, I wouldn't have had that same flexibility to also be able to support people that were important to me. So that's part of how I ended up going down into investment banking, as opposed to I wasn't born with an interest in markets. And actually, to this day, I don't have too big of an interest in financial markets and stuff like that. But when I showed up in college, was very shy and introverted, terrified of meeting new people, really pushed myself outside of my comfort zone as a way of growing. But I have always been fairly introspective, which I think, in terms of some of the things that we'll talk about today around preventing burnout, I think a lot of it is going to revolve around having just a deep understanding of yourself. And I think that for me, partially the natural tendencies towards introspection and so forth, but also some other habits, journaling, therapy, we can dive into all of these things in greater detail, have also helped me along that. So while I was at Morgan Stanley, moved around a lot. So investment banking, sales and trading, a strategy role focused on increasing business with Asian, Black, and Hispanic clients. And then HR and talent management, all of these things. I knew I eventually wanted to go to business school. So I wanted to get a holistic view of the industry, applied, ended up going to HBS. While I was there, I spent the bulk of my time focused on organizational behavior, with one of the highlight experiences being working with HBS's head of research, Professor Leslie Perlow, to create a elective course called Crafting Your Life, which is all about how do you help people live with greater intentionality and put guardrails in their place, which I think is very connected to the conversation that we'll have today. And then after graduating from HBS, I joined BCG in our Singapore office. My mom is thinking of retiring somewhere in the region. And so the idea was I would come out here and help her explore whether or not that's something she actually wanted to do. So 2020 was supposed to be our year of traveling through Southeast Asia and figuring out, whether or not she wanted to retire here. Obviously, COVID had other plans, but since moving out here to Singapore, have really just love the experience of being in Singapore. There's a lot that I really love about this country. I think every place has its pros and every place has its cons. But it's been really amazing to be abroad and just have this experience. And so, really excited to dive into the conversation. I'll pause there just to turn it back over to you, to Risha, so we can dive into any areas you're the most interesting.
Absolutely. Thanks for the background, Tristan. Really appreciate it. So I think first a little bit more about you. What intrigues you most about organizational behavior topics? You said you created this course at HBS called Crafting Your Life. Do you mind expanding a little bit about that and kind of just your interests generally?
Yeah. So in terms of the interest generally, I'd say the interest probably started in high school, although I don't know that I would have described it as an interest in organizational behavior. But in my 10th grade, I found out that I was dyslexic. And then at that point, I was matched with a learning coach. And I really saw this own transformation in my own life where I went from viewing myself as unintelligent to really being like, okay, it's not necessarily a question of intelligence. It's more so I just learn a little bit differently from the way that other people learn. So if I make these slight modifications, I'll be able to be a much more effective student. And so I think that seeing that transformation in myself made me realize that if you can give people their own their own blueprint or roadmap towards whatever it is that's going to make them feel effective and so forth, that for me is how I was able to kind of transform my own life. And I found then in terms of translating that to organizational behavior, what I'm describing is more psychology and my own psychology. And it feels like very much tackling this topic at an individual level. I think what got really interesting to me is then once I got to college and I started, taking courses in management and so forth, then I started to realize, okay, there's a scalable way to potentially have this kind of impact. And then how can organizations help facilitate people in terms of their own growth journey? And I think that the culture of an organization, the feedback culture, a lot of these things are really can either be an obstacle or can help accelerate a person in their own growth. And so the two in my mind, go hand in hand in terms of personal individual growth psychology, um, at more of a micro level and then more of a macro level, organizational behavior, culture, these types of topics. So that's how I became interested in it. And then in terms of the organizational behavior course that we were creating at HBS, so there's this class that everybody takes that it's part of the leadership course, but we have one class session where we read all of these alumni letters that were written by people who had graduated from HBS, 20 or so years ahead. And they were basically writing letters, kind of reflecting on how their lives have unfolded. And a lot of the students after this class session had questions for the professor who wrote it, basically, in many ways, saying a lot of these lives don't actually seem to have unfolded all that great. Um, and they wanted to kind of continue talking about it. And that actually led to the professor basically putting an open call for students that were interested in working with her to actually create a course to be able to allow students to grapple with this thing that was very clearly on their mind. And so I entered into what was basically like a pilot for creating this course. So there were 17 of us that were all working with this professor, both kind of taking the course and designing it at the same time. So the 17 of us, we were broken up into basically pairs. And we would each tackle a different topic. So for me, I was tackling reflection. There was another topic on, mental wellness. There was another topic on, there was another topic on like physical health. There's a whole bunch of different topics that we covered and split up. And um, then we kind of created, designed this course, launched the course. It ended up being one of the more popular courses. So I think now it launched for the first time in fall of 2017. It's one of less than 10 courses that have gone in the first round overall. There's like a lottery for classes. It's one of 10 that have gone in the first round overall. So really interesting experience. And as a part of it, I got to interview about 120 HBS alum. These were all 45 to 60-minute interviews, and I asked every single one of them the same question of tell me about how your life has unfolded after HBS, highlighting any major personal and professional transitions which you went through, what were the trade-offs that you had to make, and how did you come to those decisions. And we just really dived into whatever topic they would raise during that opening conversation would basically make up the bulk of the rest of the conversation. And we
Mm.
would really dive into a discussion. And for me, it was just this eye-opening experience that ultimately got me to realize that up until that point, I had been much more focused on the professional side of the equation. And then this whole research project was a turning point in my own life, and that I started to realize it probably makes more sense for me to start to pay much more attention to the personal side of the equation, and so forth. So that's kind of how it all, I guess, evolved.
Awesome. Cool, Tristan. I think we're all really excited to learn from you and what your research has uncovered. But I think starting off to dive into like how to maintain balance, I think my first question is, you work at BCG in professional services, not an easy industry to be in when you're maintaining work life balance. I think my first question is, how do you even make time for hosting these sessions, and what keeps you motivated to, when you're maybe, drowning in tons of work and just want to keep your head down? How do you maintain that drive and motivation to continue this interest in organizational behavior and delivering what you have to say to others who are looking up to you?
Yeah. And so in some ways, I think that for the motivation for these events, they actually, in a counterintuitive way, they save me time by basically, there's about 25 people on the call right now. You can imagine if I was trying to have a one-on-one conversation with every single person, it would not be feasible. And so I'd say the reason that I think about this as it saving time is, as a first generation college student, I really benefited from the opportunity to talk to people who were 5 to 10 years ahead of me, who would very transparently tell me about how their life has unfolded. And I would not have the type of opportunities that I have today if it wasn't for that. So for me, I would never feel really comfortable if there were just a bunch of people reaching out to me on LinkedIn and I was just deleting or archiving or blocking the messages. That's not something that, it just wouldn't sit well with me. And so when I was first at Morgan Stanley, I was really trying to keep up with the people that were sending me messages. I was having phone calls with people at like 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, talking about breaking into investment banking. And it wasn't sustainable. So I started really small in terms of gathering groups of, 5 people before the workday would start. They would come to Morgan Stanley's office. We would sit down. I'd answer any questions, almost like an office hour model that a professor would hold during college. And then after these sessions, a lot of times people would ask, hey, is it okay if I come again? And would it be okay if I bring, another one of my friends who's also interested in breaking into investment banking? And, I'd say sure. And then sure enough, over time, it just started growing to the point where, the group size was too large to continue doing it in the morning, right? If you're going to have 5 guests coming into Morgan Stanley's office in the morning, that's one thing. If it's 30, 40, 50, that's a whole event, and that's another thing. So I started moving the events to evenings and weekends, when the office space wasn't really being used. Um, and I just started to realize that, in addition to being a more effective use of time in terms of grouping people, I also felt that people that came for the conversations benefited actually more in some cases than they would from a one-on-one conversation. Because I oftentimes feel as though for some of these topics, people might have one or two burning questions that they want to ask, but then there's, 8 to 10 questions that are also relevant for them that they just didn't know the right way to ask that question. And so they really benefit from being able to hear the other questions that people pose and so forth. So I think the motivation for these events is really, I want to be able to be accessible to people if they have a question that they're trying to pose to me. Um, like everybody, we're all limited by time. So being able to have one-on-one conversations with every single person is not going to be feasible, but it is feasible in my mind to carve out, an hour or two every week or two in order to have conversations like this. So this is basically what I've been moving towards in terms of these group conversations. And it's also for me, it's usually the thing that I look forward to the most in a given week. So it's easy to make sure that you hold it accountable. And then if, I will oftentimes do these sessions at either 7 a.m. Singapore, 8 a.m. Singapore. which means that you can do it at a time that isn't going to conflict with your normal working hours. And I tend to avoid evenings because I know that evenings, from a work perspective, can be unpredictable. So the likelihood that I have something pop up that prevents me from being able to host one of these sessions at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. or even 11 p.m., who knows? But it's very rare that something would ever pop up at that would get in the way of me being able to host something at 7 a.m. So I'd say by being intentional in terms of where in my day I'm placing it, I'm able to kind of both balance actually doing events like this, and they do give me a great sense of purpose and meaning, which I then think makes all of the work that you do for the rest of the week, the rest of the day, a lot easier when you feel like you've accomplished something.
Thanks, Tristan. Um, so you mentioned that something could pop up at 10 or even 11 at night in consulting. And I think you'll see that in so many different industries nowadays where you're just kind of round the clock working and working and it's unpredictable. So when we think of conventional work-life balance, we think you work 9 to 6, 9 to 5, you shut off and you have the rest of the evening for yourself. But I think especially during the pandemic, we haven't really been able to have that shut off time. So my question to you is how do you define work life balance for yourself and how do you successfully achieve that?
Yeah, so I've always thought about work-life balance for me more in the long term than in the short term. So if I think about what this means for me in the long term, it's like every year I think there's basically two things I'm trying to prioritize for. One is productivity, two is satisfaction. Not in any sort of order, but from a productivity perspective, do I feel like I'm growing as a person? Do I feel like I'm learning a lot? Do I feel like I'm setting myself up for greater success in the future? And then from a satisfaction perspective, do I feel good about the relationships that I have? Am I enjoying my day to day? Do I feel optimistic about my future? These are some of the questions that I would be asking myself on the satisfaction side of the equation. So I think that that's how I'm defining it and then how I'm achieving it. I think that from a productivity perspective, having mentors that can really hold me accountable. So I'm always very proactive. Again, that'll be a theme of the discussion. I'm always very proactive in terms of reaching out to people that are 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead of me. And that can really allow me to see myself in terms of am I growing? Am I learning? Am I pushing myself? Am I setting myself up for success? Because as we're going through life, all of these phases of our life feel they are new for us every time we enter them, but there's a whole lot of people who have been in the point of life where they've just graduated from business school and now they're establishing their career. So to kind of learn from people in terms of how they navigated it. And then in terms of satisfaction, I think that like journaling and close friends can help keep me accountable. But by doing all of this in my mind, by doing all of the conversations with mentors, the conversations with close friends, the journaling, it allows me to really almost observe my own life as though I'm kind of outside of my own body, looking at myself and looking at like what I'm prioritizing and so forth. And that gives me a sense of when I am out of balance. Um, and when I am out of balance, I think then it's a matter of actually being proactive about speaking up and telling people that you're out of balance. And some organizations and make it easier to do that than others. And I would argue that the consulting firms, while they're of course very demanding in terms of the hours and so forth, they're also environments where if you speak up and you say something is not working for you personally, they will restructure the way that they're working, and the teams are very nimble such that if you need to change the way that you're working from one week to the next, you can just change the way that the team works together. And so at BCG, we have something that we call predictability, teaming, and open communication, PTO. And we do these conversations once every single week. And basically, every person will fill out a survey on Monday that basically has them reflect on a lot of these questions that I would ask myself normally in terms of, do you feel like you're learning on this project? Are you adding value to the client? Is the work that you're doing, is it sustainable? Everybody anonymously fills this out. And then at the end of the week, you have a report that will come in and it will basically
show, where the whole team is. Green if everything is good, red if it's a problem area. And it's a tool, right, that exists to be able to have some of these open conversations around whether or not you feel like you're burning out and so forth. I think the challenge is that most people, especially most junior people within the organization, even if it's say red for like sustainability and everybody kind of knows that the project isn't working for them, most people are not going to actually kind of speak up and say that something is not working for them. Um, I have always, maybe it's because I'm super familiar with. So this PTO actually was created by the same, in partnership with the same professor that did this Crafting Your Life project. She worked with BCG about 10 to 15 years ago to create this thing called predictability, teaming, and open communication. There's a book that she wrote, which is called Sleeping with Your Smartphone. And it's all about how this PTO program was created. And so I think that there's a lot in there. Although that book is more so thinking about balance from an organizational perspective as opposed to from an individual perspective. So that is more about thinking about how you can help your team achieve balance as opposed to how you as an individual can achieve balance. But I basically, this tool exists, and I use the tool in the sense that, like, if a project is not sustainable with the senior partners on the line, I'll be very transparent. I'll be like, I had one project where it got to the point where I was like, look, we're at Wednesday and I've had a cumulative, we're at Thursday and I've had a cumulative like 4 or 5 hours of sleep this week. I was like, my mind is like mush and I can't actually do the job that you're telling me to do. And I just went into like details about how this was not only like my experience. And I was just like, look, this is like what the team is going through right now. And in fairness, the senior partners like weren't even really aware that it was happening, because nobody was saying anything. Nobody wanted to say anything. And to the credit of the team, that was the very next week things changed. They were structured. Before this we had kind of morning check-ins with the client and 5 p.m. check-ins with the client, and it just felt like it was, between morning and 5 p.m. you were just on phone calls the whole time, and then you had to produce enough work between 5 p.m. and the next morning for you to kind of have something to show to the client in the morning meeting, and it just wasn't sustainable. And the senior leadership ended up saying, okay, we're going to separate this. Senior leadership can cover the end of day updates with the client to give the junior team a little bit more breathing room. So and in that moment, I had like people on my team actually reach out to me and basically like thank me for saying something, because it just completely changed the dynamic. So I think that part of it is recognizing when you're in one of these stretches that's just not sustainable, and then really communicating it to your manager in a way that is like vivid, and not like through the lens of I'm not, it's one thing to be like, we're working really hard. It's another thing to be like, my vision is starting to kind of be impaired, and like I feel like I'm losing my appetite. And most managers, if you come to them and you actually spell that out to them, most managers are going to restructure. There's something fundamentally wrong with the working environment if that is how you're feeling at the end of a work week. And so most managers, I think, would restructure it if you ever actually came to them and told them
Mhm.
what you were experiencing and why. Um, and I'd be very detailed about it, because they're also, it might be the scenario that like you're doing work that maybe doesn't need to be done. And maybe the solution is the manager can just remove part of that from your plate. Maybe it's a reshuffling in terms of passing it around your team. But I think that that open communication piece is really important. So if you're going through something difficult, people have to know that you're going through that difficult thing, or else there's just no way that they'll be able to help you or problem solve or solution alongside you.
Super helpful, Tristan. I think that makes sense. On the personal side, it seems like the main things that you're saying are, first, open line of communication. Second is just being kind of bold enough or brave enough to really go to the manager, the senior partner, and saying, hey, this is my experience, and spelling out exactly what it is, versus saying, this is unsustainable, change it, but really spelling out your experience there.
Mhm.
I think want to dive into like the personal side of maintaining balance for you. So outside of work, even if it is like a sustainable project in consulting, it might still be say 10 hours a day, which still I think is a significant amount of your time each day. What are some of your daily rituals or weekly rituals to make sure that you're just performing, you know, at that caliber that you want to perform at every day?
Yeah. So for sure, every morning, and the morning rituals are the rituals that I will say I'm the best at keeping. I think I do a really good job of keeping the morning rituals. The during the day rituals, end of day rituals, a bit less so, but I try my best. In terms of the morning, for me, the biggest thing is every morning, before I wake up, the first or before I check my messages, text messages, before I check emails, before I check anything, the first thing that I do is actually I write in a journal. And so I'll basically, in my mind, that represents the purest thoughts in terms of what is on my mind. And so that's the first thing that I do. The second, the next thing I'll stretch every morning so that, yeah, I just feel better. I'll step outside so that I have a little moment of fresh air. And I'm not talking about like going for a super extended long walk, but actually there's a little bench right outside of my door. I'll usually just go outside and sit on that bench. And for me, that's a combination of fresh air and an opportunity to journal and so forth. And then I try to envision what is going to make today a successful day. And then usually and I think about try to envision one thing that, like, if I do this today, I will feel good about how today went. And then when I plug back in, so when I fire up my email, I check my phone for the first time. Actually before I do that, I try and at least lay the initial steps for accomplishing that one thing before I check messages. um, so my goal is really to try and get this one thing accomplished as quick as possible, because then I've started the day and I feel, good about how the day is going. Then, during the day, I try and make note of what are the meetings that I don't actually need to be in front of the computer for. And this is actually more so something that has become a ritual during like COVID and during the virtual working times, is I'll mark my calendar for like what are the things that I don't actually need to be in front of a computer for. And I'll physically mark them by changing the default calendar, is blue, and I'll just change it to like purple. And in my mind, that's a reminder for like, okay, go for a walk while I'm taking this phone call. And I take a lot of walks during phone call. Like I take a lot of phone calls during walks, and people are generally very understanding of it, especially now when you're like, look, I have back-to-back meetings all day. Unless I have this phone call while walking, there's no way that I'm going to be able to have fresh air today or go for a walk or whatever it might be. So that really is helpful. Another thing that I do during the day, I think a lot of people have to-do lists, and I guess I would describe my version of this is a little bit of a modified version of a to-do list, in that I'll write out the things that I want to get done in a given day, but rather than crossing them out or deleting if it's done virtually or erasing it, I will have a physical to-do list, and then I'll take a highlighter, and when I've done something, I'll just highlight it. And so for me, it accomplishes the same thing that a to-do list would accomplish in terms of like reminding you what you need to do, but there's also the visual showing you that you're accomplishing things throughout the day. And to see the amount of highlighter ink increase over the course of the day, for me it's kind of encouraging. It represents a small win. So Adam Grant's piece around languishing that he recently put out, which is this, basically, for an easy way of describing it for those who aren't familiar, it's this feeling where it's not necessarily you're depressed, but you're not thriving. You're somewhere in between. And it's this, for lack of a better way of being able to describe it, you're just feeling kind of blah at any point in time. And one of the things that the article and his research talks about is the importance of like small wins. And for me, that highlighter and just making note of the things that I accomplish throughout the day is another ritual that gives me, leaves me feeling encouraged. And then in terms of end of day rituals, I'll usually I'll usually do something at the end of the day to kind of shut my mind off. So I will either like, well, the first thing I'll do is I'll set my alarm for the next day, and then I'll kind of put my phone away. And my phone doesn't ring. My phone doesn't, there's nothing that can really make my phone buzz. And then I'll either watch an episode of TV, or I'll probably watch an episode of TV, and then I try to like either go for a walk or a swim or do something sort of like just a short wind down, so that I'm not looking at a screen, ideally right before going to bed. And then I will kind of come back, I'll shower, I'll journal, I'll read. I try and get all of that done. It sounds like, super long, but like I'll try to get all of that done kind of within 45 to 60 minutes. So the TV, it's like it's a 20-minute episode or a 25-minute episode of something. It's not a super long walk that I'll go on, and it's not a super long journaling that I'll do, or super long. And if I'm reading, it's usually something that I've written to myself, or a reminder, or like, something short like that. So maybe it's closer to 60, 75 minutes. But then I will, and then I'll go to sleep, and I have a little white noise machine, with a 15-minute timer that shuts itself off after 15 minutes. And for me, I will usually set that before I go to bed. And it's helpful because that allows me to know whether or not like everything is okay. It's almost like checking in with myself, because if it takes me more than 15 minutes, it doesn't usually take more than 15 minutes to fall asleep. I don't think it usually takes me more than 5 minutes to fall asleep, but there are nights where it does take me more than 15 minutes to fall asleep. And it's almost always when there's something on my mind that I'm grappling with that is leaving me feeling unsettled. And so it's actually an indication to myself, if everything is okay, or if there's something that I need to be addressing. And so that's kind of like what my end of day rituals are. I think I'm very good again when it comes to the morning rituals, the journaling, the stretching, envisioning what I want to do for the day, tackling one thing. I am less good with the during the day rituals and the end of the day rituals, but I think that with these rituals, it's also important to be like forgiving of yourself. Nobody's going to be able to do it like 100% of the time. And so even if it comes to something like meditation, a lot of people will say, and a lot of people will start meditation and then they'll stop meditation because they're quote unquote bad at it. And really, like if you're even attempting to do the meditation and you're just like, you're trying to get into that habit. I don't know. I just think that any of these habits you're trying to take on, embrace them. But if they don't end up working out, right away, don't view that as kind of a failure. I think it's all just part of the learning process. But I do think that rituals play a big role in all of this.
That makes total sense. I like the part where you're saying forgive yourself if it's not working out, but at least just start trying. And I think segueing into the next question is, where would you recommend people start implementing something to, wind down at night, or implement some sort of ritual in the morning? Because I think so many of us wake up, like turn over on our bed, pick up our phone, turn off our alarm, and then look at everything on our phone screen. Um,
Yeah.
but is there like one thing that you would recommend people integrate into their days that is maybe like the easiest for you to make sure that you're checking off every day? You say your morning rituals are probably easier.
Yeah. Well, I think, and this was advice that a mentor had given me, in terms of if there's something that's really important to you, do it first thing in the day, because you never know what's going to happen throughout the course of the day. And if it's important to you, you want to get it done. So
Mhm.
do it before the life starts throwing curveballs your way, which is inevitably going to happen. Everybody, has a plan. That plan, life comes at you fast and changes what your plan is. That's true from a year to year perspective. That's true from a day to day perspective. So I think that's a big piece for me in terms of where to start. I would say start small and start with anything. And it really benefit is amplified, I think, if you're starting with something that increases your awareness of yourself. So if you're starting with something like, journaling, if you're starting with something like meditation, if you're starting with something like going to therapy, all of these are things that I think will increase self-awareness. And then when you have that increased self-awareness, I think then you have a greater ability to identify things in your life that are causing you stress, things in your life that are exhausting you. So I'd say that that's one place to start. The other thing to start is, add a 10-15 minute buffer to whatever you're currently doing, in terms of like, try to resist looking at your phone first thing in the morning. um, because when you look at your phone, that's basically, it's almost like that's what other people are telling you is important for you to do.
Mm-hmm.
And you get all of these, and especially if you're, it's one thing if you're checking text messages, if you're checking emails, if you're checking, and it's even worse if you start checking like social media and things like that first thing in the morning, because you're just filling your mind with all of these other thoughts besides your and these thoughts, our brains only have the ability to process so much at one point in time. So you're taking your own thoughts and immediately in the morning shoving them out of your head and replacing them with what people around you and social media and the world want to put in your head. And I just think that you can't possibly hope to live with any sort of intentionality in my mind, if you're not giving yourself the space to actually think about what's important to you and live according to that. So um, that I would say, I guess, is the first piece, is do anything that will increase awareness. And so for me, I think that, journaling is in my mind, maybe this is different for other people, but if I'm thinking, journaling, meditation, working out, therapy, if I use those as like four things that will give you some space and some clarity, I personally think that the easiest one of those to do in bite sizes is journaling, but that might be my own natural bias. But whatever it is, I would just start with something that's very bite sized, and that allows you to increase that awareness. And then with time, that will start to, I think, allow you to build habits and live with much more intentionality.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I think coming like with the intentionality part of it, you're also thinking about, I think younger professionals are driven by this idea of like, I need to find my purpose. That's the only way I can stay passionate about what I'm doing, kind of continue to wake up every day, especially during the pandemic, and feel excited to go to work. So I think this kind of ties into like trusting your intuition, and I'm curious to hear what your advice is for people hoping to just get in touch with their intuition to figure out what it is that drives them every day. Because I think up until this point, you're kind of told to go to school, like get great grades, like go to college, continue to get great grades. But then when you enter the workforce, it's very much like a gray area. You're like, okay, there's this like performance review that I have to prep towards per se, but that's not enough to like keep you working hard, like keep you working extremely hard every day. So there is something that needs to drive you, I think, every day to do your best. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are in terms of getting in trust or in touch with your intuition.
Yeah. So I think that it, for me, is connecting what you're doing in the current day to how it helps you get closer to what you ultimately want to be doing. And
Mhm.
as long as you can find the purpose in what you're doing in the present moment, then I think it becomes a lot easier to have that motivation to do well. Because I agree with you, performance reviews are not going to be enough to really keep you motivated on a day-to-day basis. And actually, on top of that, I think that it's a slippery slope if you start to evaluate your own success on the basis of how somebody else is reviewing your performance, because they may be saying to you, you're doing a fantastic job, and that may be leads you to the illusion that you're doing well, but really maybe you're neglecting everything in your personal life, and that's crumbling. And so that's not an actual review in terms of how you're doing. And the vice versa is also true. Your company may tell you that you're doing a horrible job and that you're on the verge of being let go, and that's not an actual indication that you're not, you know it's not an actual indication that you're not an effective person or that you're not good or anything like that. Um, so I would agree to kind of I would not peg I never peg self-worth to performance evaluations, and I think that gives you a lot of more freedom and flexibility to define for yourself whether or not you feel like you are being successful, quote unquote. But for me, I think that going back to that conversation of the daily motivation, when I can connect it to the longer term purpose that's important to me, like I think one of the things that has been very helpful has been understanding the type of impact that I want to have, which basically I boil it down into like two core questions that I want to be able to solve or work on solving, because these aren't things that anybody solves in a lifetime. But how can you help people reach their full potential? So at an individual level, that's a big piece of what I want to do. And events like the one that we're having now, these open invite conversations, these are directly connected to that. So again, to that point of like, how do I make time for these things? Because I know that that is what I'm trying to solve for, and this fits into that. It's really easy for me to say, okay, this needs to be a part of my day. The second question is, how can you help organizations create a culture where employees are engaged when they show up in the workplace? So this is really on the back of Gallup has done a whole lot of research that shows that the majority of people are disengaged with their work and are effectively just going to work for a paycheck. And in my mind, that represents just a huge loss in terms of human like potential. And also it just represents like a huge misallocation of resources that in terms of where corporates are spending their money from a recruitment perspective, retention, all of these different things. So these are kind of the problems that I get excited about solving. So when I think about consulting, in my mind, this is a great opportunity for me to basically be one of the ways that consulting has been described to me. It's like you're a doctor for companies, right? And part of what you're doing is you are thinking about all of these big changes that the company is going to make. And then I keep myself motivated by really asking myself, well, how are they going to actually make these changes? I spend a lot of time, even if it's not necessarily speaking directly with every single one of the decision makers at the company. For fun, I usually will sit around and I'll think to myself, what's the CEO going to have to do to basically make this thing work? What's the CFO going to have to do? What's the chief human resources going to have to do? Do I think they're going to be able to do that? If I was coaching them, what would be the things that I would focus on working on them with? So everything that I do, I immediately try to box it or put it in or connect it, I should say, to one of these two core central questions. And anytime I can make that linkage very clear in my head, it becomes so much easier to work in a way that I'm more effective, I'm more focused, it's less exhausting, it's more fulfilling. So for me, I think that the daily motivation comes from being able to connect it to those two guiding questions that I used to ask myself.
That is really helpful. I love that. I think I want to ask if you have like a specific situation that you can think back to where you were maybe working in financial services or consulting or any other of your professional experiences where you felt like this isn't fulfilling to me in either of these two buckets that you've pointed out, and where you felt like, oh shoot, like I really need to reconsider what I'm doing, or I need to just reassess the way I'm structuring my day to make sure it's tailored to these two buckets. Like, what were your kind of like steps to get out of that rut if you've experienced something like that?
Yeah, no, I definitely have experienced that many times. The biggest and deepest rut definitely came right after college in my first role within investment banking. I think that is the closest in my life I've ever been to. Like I don't use the word lightly because I know that there's actual definitions for it, but I think that's the closest that I was to being depressed in my life. And that like every single morning when I woke up, um, I would physically get sick when I was on my way. Like my stomach would start to hurt when I was on my way into work, and I thought about, oh man, I'm going to be here from like 9 a.m. to 2 a.m. today.
Yeah.
over and over and over again. So I really did not like investment banking pretty much from the moment that I started through more or less the whole experience. And that was a very low point in my career that I, told myself I'm never going back to this feeling this way from a work perspective. And I certainly haven't ever felt that bad about work from that point forward. But um, and I guess in terms of how I got out of the rut and what I did, I mean, the first thing, like my plan was to quit as quickly as possible. I was like, I'm gonna quit. I'm gonna go back to the drawing board. I'm gonna like recruit for, as though I'm a college student. And in my mind, I was like, okay, it doesn't seem like it'll be that hard if I just quit my job to get another job. And the way that I thought about it is if, these companies were interested in me when I was a senior in college. Now I'm a senior in college plus 1 year of investment banking. I was like, I just need the time and the space to quit. And so I told this plan to a mentor of mine, and he knew that long term I was interested in going to business school. And one of the questions that he posed to me was, he asked me, Tristan, how many people are there at Morgan Stanley? At the time, there was, more than 50,000 people. I think there's now more than 70,000 people or something like that. Um, I was like, I don't know, 50,000 people. And he's like, okay. And he's like, I get that, like, you're not having a good time in investment banking, but are you sure that like the 49,999 other jobs aren't a good fit for you? And I realized that I hadn't actually even considered it. In my mind, investment banking and Morgan Stanley were synonymous, right?
Hmm.
So, like, if I was going to be in financial services, it was investment banking. And that's just because most of my peers and at Wharton, that was kind of the mindset, was like, it was kind
Yeah.
of, if you're going into financial services, it was investment banking. Um, and then I didn't realize that these organizations are so multifaceted, and like banking is one part of it. So anyway, this led to me, based on the advice from my mentor, actually exploring and looking at other things. And then in that process, I realized that I actually really like Morgan Stanley's culture a lot, and I really like the firm a lot. It just didn't like investment banking. And
Yeah.
so I switched from investment banking into sales and trading. And immediately when I switched over, I started feeling amazing. Like, friends who had known me for a while were like, Tristan, like, something is different, before I even like said anything about switching a job. So it was just completely uh I felt like a different person
Yeah.
immediately when I switched from the role that wasn't a good fit to the role that, was a much better fit. And then from there, it got even better. And then I switched into this other role that was a strategy role focused on increasing business with Asian, Black, and Hispanic clients. And I felt like there was a lot of meaning in this work. And I really liked the person that I was really inspired by the person that I was reporting into. Um, and so I guess on the point of trusting your intuition, I think that if the current role that you're in doesn't feel right, you're probably right, that you need to move. Moving doesn't always necessarily mean you have to switch companies.
Hmm.
That's the other thing that I've realized, is that you can switch roles, and oftentimes that will allow you to, navigate your career in a way that you're not taking a major like step back. I think if I had quit Morgan Stanley at that time, I really believe that would have been the wrong decision for me to make. But leaving investment banking was definitely the right decision for me to make. So I'd say, if you start to feel that the seat that you're in is not a good seat for you to be in, I would really try and reach out to a lot of people internally and externally, and try and find other options that will be a better fit. And then I would try and move to those options at the soonest appropriate time, right? I don't think that, necessarily just saying, okay, I'm going to quit right now is it's a bit impulsive.
Hmm.
But I would try and get there as quickly as possible.
That's super helpful. Thanks for being super authentic about that. I think really relatable for a lot of people, and they might not even understand what they're going through. But the way you said it, I think really illuminates it for me how I was feeling at the beginning of my career as well. So I think like you mentioned that you might have like just quit and you needed like the time and space really. And luckily it worked out that you found something internal that you were excited about. But say maybe you're in a smaller organization and this is like the only function that you have the technical skills for. So you're planning to just switch firms. What are your thoughts on having like a career gap in your resume? I think we're always like preached like that is career suicide. Like you just don't ever want to have a career gap. But I want to hear your thoughts on whether it is as detrimental to your long-term career success or not, because that's the sense that I've gotten, but I feel like it can't be true.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the idea of the career gap is like I wouldn't fear having a career gap. Everybody that I know who has been fired, which is basically like forcing you to have a career gap, ends up in a better position than the one that they were in. For sure, from a satisfaction perspective, from a meaningfulness perspective, in many cases from a compensation perspective. So I think that it's a myth in my mind that like the, avoid the career gap, avoid the career gap, avoid the career gap. Um, I think at the end of the day, it's all about how you're able to kind of communicate your story. And quite frankly, if you take a gap, it will increase your ability to tell a story because in the day-to-day work, especially if your job is on the more demanding
Mm-hmm.
side, you don't actually have the space to think about what your story is. So if you're trying to recruit for things and you don't actually have the space to be able to think about who you are and what you want, it's going to be really difficult for you to be able to kind of convey that, communicate it, and so forth. So I would say that, and then the other thing I'd say about a gap, and this is connected to how you communicated in terms of the story and so forth. I think that um, you can always be the founder of something, right? So let's say I decided to quit. Rather than having a gap on my resume, I might just say founder and come up for a name of these Zoom events that I am doing, and then my story would be, look, I was really passionate about this. I wanted to be able to have an impact. I thought maybe let me try to get this off of the ground. I realized in the process, what, I'm not an entrepreneur. So now I'm coming back and I'm looking for corporate work, but I was really confident that I'd be able to turn this into a business or have an impact. And so you can also spin all of these things so that they don't actually have to be a gap in experience. But that's I think part of just sharing your story. I think the bigger picture to the question, I wouldn't fear the gap. Like if you're in a smaller organization and there's not another place that you can pivot into,
Yeah.
I would say just go ahead, and I think you should quit the organization if it doesn't. And a lot of this depends on so many variables. If you
Yeah.
can search for your next job while in your current seat, then yeah, I think that's great. Go search for the next job while in your current seat. If being in your current seat really is inhibiting you from being able to like find something that's a right fit, then I think you're better off quitting, having a gap. Again, you can do something to fill in the blank so it doesn't have to be described as a gap. But I think you're much better off doing that. I think the big thing is just like when you see that you're in the seat that's not working for you, um, find a different seat. Don't just continue. I think the quote around insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And if you're going into work, like let's say you've been in a job for a year and you're like, this isn't working for me. It's 365 data points.
Yeah.
Like it's probably not going to change on the 366th day. So like I think knowing when it's time to cut the losses, and just move away and move towards something that is going to be a better fit for you is important.
Yeah, I think that's so helpful. I love the way you articulated that, especially where you can like flip the story. You can say what I'm actually like doing for fun to fulfill myself. You can just put that on the resume. I think that's really helpful. I think we have like 5 minutes left, so just want to see if anyone else had additional questions for Triston, whether you want to pop it in the chat function or ask it directly. Um, But yeah, if anyone has anything, feel free to go ahead and ask. If not, oh, Ryan raised a hand.
I apologize. I came in a little late, so I'm not sure if you already covered this, but I came across your LinkedIn profile a couple of days ago and reached out to connect. And you seem really interesting. And I just kind of had a question career path wise. I'm in college right now. Um, I have a couple of different interests, but seeing that you went into investment banking now that you're in consulting and you kind of went the more human resources route at Morgan Stanley and then went to your MBA, I'm kind of curious as to where your goals are 5 to 10 years from now. If you had, you know, um, something that you wanted to do in college or as you were like a kid, if you're pursuing that, or if you're kind of testing out different things and seeing what you like and what you don't like.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question in terms of really thinking about the goals, not just in terms of long term, but what you're describing is also looking at the goals in terms of like 5 to 10 years and how the thinking around that varies. So I think that I mean, when I was a kid, my goal was to be an NBA player, so that was short lived. But in terms of once I was in college, I think my goals actually initially in the earlier stages were more shorter terms, and I think that's because as a first generation college student, nobody in my family was doing anything business related, so I couldn't really envision what the long term necessarily looked like. So as a freshman, I was looking at like seniors, and then as a recent graduate, I was looking for people who would work for the first 5 years. And so for me, I guess as a freshman, my initial goal was I knew that I eventually wanted to go to business school, and I knew that I wanted to do either investment banking or consulting. And I developed that as a goal actually the summer after my sophomore year. I was doing an internship with Google, and a lot of the people who I looked up to and respected the most, they either had an MBA or they either had an MBA or they had and or time in investment banking and consulting. Like one example, who's still one of the people professionally that I look up to the most is Laszlo Bach, he was the chief people officer of Google, and now he's gone on to create his own company and so forth. But he's another example of somebody who's gotten he got his MBA from Yale, and then he worked at McKinsey, so he has a background in consulting. And so I think when I was looking at a lot of these people that I admired even in Google and saw that they had these things, that became the goal for me. And then it was like, okay, if I know that I eventually want to do this 5 years from now, what do I have to piece together in order to get there? Which is where I think, Ryan, your question around like the 5 to 10 year goals is helpful, because for me, by setting that 5 year goal to 10 year goal, I mean, I knew that, okay, so when I was at Morgan Stanley, I knew I eventually want to go to business school. Now, if I want to go to business school, what are some of the things that I have to do? Okay, one of the things that I have to do is decide which business school do I want to go to. And that led to this whole process of discovery, outreach, conversations, that so much of it, by the time I got to it, I knew that it was like, okay, I was able to refine the question so that it was no longer, I know that I want to go to business school, but it became eventually, I know that I want to go to HBS specifically. And that was like a whole lot of conversation, such that like when it came time to actually applying, HBS was the only school that I applied to. And this was because I knew there were very specific things about that program that I wanted. And so I think that when you have the 5 year goalpost, it just allows you, I think, to be a little bit more tailored in terms of working your way there. And yeah, so that is how I was basically navigating it and thinking about it. But let me pause there. I want to make sure, Ryan, that I've kind of addressed the core part of your question in terms of how I thought through it from a goal setting and then pursuing it.
Yeah, I was just more curious. I think you did a great job answering it. I was more curious. I think a lot of the times, like you said, as a college student, you're given 4 years if you start at the very beginning to kind of figure out what you want to do, which is a very short period of time. And so I see a lot of my peers more so chase a job out of college rather than a career. It's something that I see a lot. And so that's kind of why I commonly ask the question 5 to 10 years from now, what do you want to do? Because I feel like people, they see like a higher than average pay here or big name company. Even though it's something that they're not interested in doing, they still chase after it because they're chasing a job rather than a long-term career. So I kind of wanted to see what your perspective was on that. If you had experienced that at all, and kind of what your long-term goals are, and
Yeah.
how you're achieving those.
So I think one thing that is helpful as a college student is to basically, rather than feeling like you need to have it all figured out in terms of what you want to do for the rest of your life, just have a hypothesis and use that hypothesis and test it on different people. So you can on a Monday, you can go to an event and you could tell somebody, I think that I'm interested in investment banking, and here's why. And then on a Tuesday, you can go to a different event and you could tell somebody else, I think that I'm interested in consulting, and here's why. And then on Wednesday, you can go and you could say, I think that I'm interested in retail, and here's why. And you can keep on reinventing yourself, and nobody is sitting at the top of all of this and tracking you and saying, on Monday you're saying this, but Wednesday you're saying, like, nobody is doing that to anybody, and especially not to a college student. So you don't actually need to know what it is that you want to do. But the reason that I suggest that approach, though, is I think it's much more effective than I think the trap that some college students fall into is every time they have a conversation, they go to somebody and they say, I think that I'm either interested in investment banking, or I'm interested in consulting or wealth management or sales or tech. And the people that you're talking to aren't really going to be able to guide you because you've now jumbled their mind so much. Whereas if you go to somebody and say, I'm really interested in investment banking for consumer companies, now that person can basically say, oh, I have a friend that does this, or oh, like I follow this blog that's related to kind of consumer, or oh, like I read this book that was like really valuable for these reasons. So it allows you, I think, to get much more targeted advice that will be helpful, as opposed to if you're just going and kind of high level saying, well, here are 10 different things that I'm interested in. Then the other thing that I would say that you can do from people who are 5 to 10 years out is you can almost like test a lot of these, you could test a lot of these different things with people, right? So let's say you talk to 20 people and you tell 5 people that you're really interested in investment banking, you tell 5 people it's tech, you tell 5 it's retail, you tell 5 it's consulting. Um, in the process of you trying to tell people that you're interested in A versus B versus C versus D, you'll naturally probably gravitate towards one. Every time, you might find, like, if for me as an example, if I did this with, telling people I was interested in investment banking or consulting or human capital, even as a college student, I could tell that like my it doesn't feel genuine when I'm describing investment banking, versus if I start talking about human capital, it feels very genuine. And in fact, when I do have conversations with people that are human capital related, they usually will say something to the effect of, I can tell you're passionate about this. I can tell you're excited about this. Nobody has ever said that to me about investment banking. And candidly, nobody has ever said that to me about consulting either. So it's very clear that I kind of know, is it path A versus is it path B versus is it path C? So I think that by creating these different identities of yourself and then testing them with a bunch of different people that are 5 to 10 years out, as you're mentioning, I think you can use that in order to really start to get a sense for which one of these things is actually the right fit for you.
Great, incredible advice. Thank you so much.
Oh, of course, thank you.
Thanks, Brian, for that question. I think we have, I got another question in the chat for you, Triston. Um, so she said, I imagine having significant self clarity and awareness would help with being more in touch with your intuition. You mentioned journaling for this. What are some journal prompts one can begin with to start becoming more self aware, if you have any?
Yeah, so there's one book that's called A Question a Day. And basically it asks you a different question every single day. And some of those questions will prompt you to think about how you're feeling. It might be, is there a relationship in your life that you wish were better than it is? Another question, some of it's just more kind of like I don't know, goofier in nature. And it's like, what is the most disgusting snack food that you absolutely love? But it basically, and it's a book that is about the size of one of the larger index cards. And that every single page represents 5 years. So when you're writing on it, you're basically saying, okay, this is how I'm feeling on 23rd May of 2021. And then right below that, you see how you are feeling on 23rd May in 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017. So you almost have this view in terms of how your thinking has evolved over a 5-year window in relation to each of these questions. So that book I absolutely love in terms of journaling. There's another book that is just called One Line a Day. And that one doesn't actually prompt you with anything. But I think that is just like open space, but there's such a short thing that it's basically almost like nudging you to do a Twitter sized journal entry, which also in my mind, what I liked about it, we talked about how to get started. I think it's easy to get started with baby steps when it comes to journaling, like easy for you to write, 30 words a day. That's probably not going to be too difficult, as opposed to expecting that you're going to write like 500 words a day or something like that. So I wouldn't measure the success by volume written. I would measure it by, cumulative days where you've committed to this practice. So I'd say that those are the prompts that I ask myself, but actually as a part of the same research that we were doing with crafting your life, um, basically and it's not hard to find a list of questions, right? You can just Google like good questions to reflect on every single day, and then read like 10, 15 different sources, and then pull in together a list of the questions that resonate with you. And if you do that, you'll have a really good list of questions that you can ask yourself. And we were kind of one of the things that we were creating as a part of this course, which is not a product that is launched publicly yet, but it's being used by the students who are enrolled in this course. It's basically a survey that everybody that gets sent to you every single day that asks you these questions, and you can program it and you could put in your own questions that you want to ask yourself, right? Because there's no one size fits all. I wouldn't be able to give somebody a list of the questions that I ask myself, and then that's the right set for them as well. It's not going to work that way. So I think that starting with a list and then modifying that list based on other questions that you feel like are important to be asking yourself, and then coming up with some mechanism. And it doesn't need to be fancy. I mean, any one of us could create a Google form that we have these questions in, and then basically email the form to ourselves and then snooze it so that it pops up in our inbox every single day. And then kind of you can, make sure that you're doing it once a day. And then you can customize the questions that you're asking yourself in the Google form. And then you can easily export the data at the end of a month and just look at how you're doing. A couple of things that were really helpful with the version of it that we were doing at HBS. We had basically, you had to write how you were feeling. The first question is, how are you feeling right now? And it was like one on a scale of 1 to 5, and it basically showed 5 different smiley faces, with one being, this frowny face, and 5 being this very big smiley face. And you just clicked how you're feeling. And then it asked you what's one adjective that you would use to describe how you're feeling today, and you would punch in one adjective. And then it would ask you, it would go through the questions that you basically had pre-assigned to asking yourself. And there was always an option to say, like, you know what, I don't really have any thoughts on these questions. And free form was always an option that you could do. So that's how I think, I would recommend just starting with a base that you can get from Google, create a list of questions that you think, set up a Google form of some sort, ask yourself these questions, try to keep yourself accountable to doing it on a daily basis. And that's kind of where I would start. And then your questions will evolve over time. You can swap some questions out that don't feel as relevant, and some questions in that feel particularly timely. So I think it will evolve with time.
Awesome. Thank you, Triston. I think since it is 5:10, wondering if Triston, you have any last words to say. I think this has been enormously helpful, at least for me, and I'm sure for everyone else in this call. So, on behalf of everyone, thank you for spending this time with us so early in Singapore. But if you have any last words to say as well, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, no, I guess parting thoughts would just be, I think the biggest thing on this topic is taking steps towards the right direction and not putting too much pressure to solve all of it at once and immediately. So, if anything resonated with you in this conversation, just try whatever the smallest form of it is and then grow it with time. And if none of these particular tactics or tips or thoughts resonated with you, then continue to tuning in for conversations similar to this one, and then just wait until you find the tactic that is going to work well for you, and then just try it, and give yourself a little bit of time in terms of trying it, and allow yourself the flexibility to basically evolve and grow and everything like that. So that's what I'd say there, kind of connected to this topic. I think it's really important to get the personal, the self, the mental health, all of that. It's really important to actually approach that with a lot of intentionality, in the same way that many times people approach their career with this intentionality. An assignment from their manager, they'll approach with a tremendous amount of intentionality. Yet when it comes to the basics of like, am I giving myself enough time and space to be healthy? That is not something that people approach with the same level of intentionality. So I think my big thing would be really reverse that, because your wellness is far more important than your ability to get an A+ on the assignment that your manager gives you. Both in the short term and in the long term, your wellness is more important in both of those cases. So I would prioritize it accordingly. And then I would say, I'll close this by saying thank you again, Risha, for setting up this conversation. I really do enjoy these types of talks. It's a great way to start the day. So if you're ever interested in doing another talk on a different subject or on this subject again later down the line, and or if anybody on the call is interested in hosting a similar conversation, I am really very happy to and eager to set up these conversations. I enjoy them as well, and I find a lot of benefit and fulfillment in doing them. So please do. I mean, the easiest way to reach me is just on LinkedIn. Please do shoot me a message on LinkedIn, and I'm pretty responsive there, so we can sort something out like that. But thank you again, Risha, for
Of
setting this up.
course. Thank you, Triston. This is such an insightful conversation, and thanks to everyone else for joining.